Listen up, get ready, I'm not gonna take no more. There's a revolution, a revelation going on in my soul. Buckle up, get ready, we're not gonna sit back.
Okay, all you citizens of the world, welcome back to Live from the Heartland for the week of May 29th. And I'm still Michael James, joined here by Euan Hague. And our next guest is someone I've known since he was a kid. I've known his mom, his dad, and his brothers. I think I was the one who signed his mother up in Students for Democratic Society way back. The one and only Zayn Ayers Dohrn, who is a professor at Northwestern and has been doing podcasts and books, and now has a new book out getting a lot of attention called Dangerous, Dirty, Violent, and Young, a Fugitive Family in the Revolutionary Underground. So good morning to you, Zayd.
Thanks, Mike. Thanks for having me.
How about telling us a little bit about your new book?
Yeah, well, the book is kind of a memoir about my own life growing up in the underground. You know, my parents, Bill Ayers and Bernadine Dohrn, were, of course, leaders of the Weathermen, the Weather Underground. And so by the time I was born in the late 70s, they had been on the run from the FBI for about 7 years. And so the book is a memoir of my own growing up underground as a fugitive, kind of learning what that meant, and also goes back and tells the story of how my parents were radicalized and the story of the Weather Underground and the Black Liberation Army and the kind of revolutionary undergrounds of those days.
Tell us a little bit more about your parents and what you would like to share about them.
Yeah, well, my parents are pretty unusual, pretty extraordinary people, both of them. And I think, you know, my dad has told his story before. He's written a memoir himself, Fugitive Days. But in a way, you know, my mom has never told her part of the story. And she was a very prominent figure in the kind of radical movements of that time. And I think an important historical figure. So part of my motivation in writing this book was to kind of tell my mom's story while I could still talk to her and kind of try to understand it. The very brief story about her is she went from being a pretty typical, you know, white suburban girl, straight A student, kind of head of the newspaper in high school kind of person to being FBI's 10 most wanted fugitive and what J. Edgar Hoover called the most dangerous woman in America. So part of the book is trying to unpack, how does that happen? How does what makes a revolutionary? How does somebody become that, you know? And I mean, there's a lot of ways that happens, of course, but in my mom's case, it really happened because she joined the civil rights movement as a kind of idealistic young law student. She marched with Dr. King in his rent strike in Chicago, and then Dr. King was killed, and that radicalized her. She joined SDS. She made an alliance with Fred Hampton and the Black Panthers as part of his Rainbow Coalition of interracial activist groups. And then Fred was murdered by the Chicago police. And so these are a series of events that kind of led my mom down the path to becoming more and more radical, more and more anti-government, and eventually declaring war on the United States.
How about your dad?
Yeah, my dad, he had a parallel path. You know, he grew up the son of a CEO here in Chicago, well, in the suburbs. And his dad was kind of the head of Commonwealth Edison, right? So he was a pretty privileged kid. He went off to the University of Michigan, got involved in anti-war activism, burned his draft card, was arrested at a sit-in at the Ann Arbor Selective Service Office. And, you know, he too joined SDS, became increasingly radicalized. And then when my mom split SDS to form the Weathermen, he followed her and eventually followed her into the underground. So yeah, they have these kind of parallel stories that eventually merge shortly before my birth.
So Zayd, tell us a little bit about why you decided to write this book. You've had a lot of other things going on. You did a podcast that addressed a lot of these issues. You've got a few books out. Why did you want to write this, and why did you end up doing it?
Yeah, well, so my podcast, Mother Country Radicals, was the first time that I kind of tried to tackle my family story. And the honest truth is I made that during the pandemic because a lot of my other projects were shut down. You know, I'm mostly a playwright and a professor, but during the pandemic, everything stopped. And I started to think, you know, what can I do at home? And also I started to think my parents are getting older. They were in their 80s and they are in their 80s. And I started to think, like, if I'm ever going to ask some of the questions that I wanted to ask about my family history, I'd better do it now. So I started interviewing them, not sure what it would turn into. That became this podcast, Mother Country Radicals. And then once the podcast came out, I sort of thought I had told the whole story, or at least as much of the story as I was interested in telling. And then a couple things happened. One thing is I had filed a Freedom of Information Act request with the FBI when I started working on the podcast. Of course, they stonewalled it. They wrote back and said, you want files on Bernadine Dohrn? We have something like 2,800 boxes of files on this woman. So it's going to take 15 years to process it all, And anyway, we fought them. We hired a lawyer. But by the time the podcast came out, we were still in that fight. After the podcast came out, I finally got a thumb drive from the FBI with 7,000 pages of newly declassified documents about my mom. And they were fascinating, and they shed some new light into my family history. So that got me thinking there was more to this story. And then a lot of people who had heard the podcast reached out to me, kind of like, you asked to talk to us before, we weren't sure, but now we're ready. Or like there were some secrets that we couldn't tell you, but now some of the people have passed away, so we're more comfortable sharing. And so the story started to grow. And I just felt like there was a real interesting story to tell, not only about my family, but about the history of radical and revolutionary struggle in this country. So that's really what the book is.
What stands out about your interviews with your folks? What, like some of the first things when you first started asking them questions? What do you remember about that early experience?
Yeah, well, I'll tell you two things. I'll tell you the general sense I had of it, and then I'll tell you one particular story that kind of blew my mind and led me to writing the book. The general thing is that my parents, even though their lives had been steeped in a certain kind of secrecy, right? They were underground for 10 years. They have a code in the underground about not talking, about not naming names, about keeping some stories until everybody involved has passed on. So in a certain way, it was tricky to tell this family story because it's a secret story and in a sense, a criminal investigation of my own past and my own family story. That being said, they were very transparent with me. We had some ground rules about if there's something they can't tell me, they could they couldn't lie to me, but they could say that's something we're not going to talk about. I think they only used that privilege maybe 2 times in the 3 years that I interviewed them. And both times were because I had asked about friends of theirs and what actions they had been involved in, what criminal activity they had done. So there's certain things they wouldn't say. Most things they were very open about. There were a couple things. I'll tell you just one funny thing that I stumbled upon. This is an example of what it's like to look into my family's past. I have this memory when I was like 3 or 4 years old. And like all memories of that age, it's kind of part memory and part family story that I've heard over the years. But it was this camping trip we took to West Virginia. First time I ever put up a tent, first time I ever cooked on an outdoor stove, those kinds of things. And I remember it as a fond memory for me. But as I started to do some research into this book, I was building a sort of a roadmap to the underground. I was using this old Rand McNally road atlas we had to sort of trace where we'd gone and where we'd been. And I realized that campsite where we had my very first camping trip was a half mile from the federal prison where they were keeping Assata Shakur, the head of the Black Liberation Army. And I pressed my dad on that. I said, this can't be a coincidence. And it slowly came out that indeed we had been there at the request of the Black Liberation Army to case the federal prison with the hopes of breaking Assata out of prison. So it's just one of those funny things where my own family history and my own childhood memories collided with this piece of radical history that I had never known before.
Zayd, what was your most emotional experience in doing the interviews with your parents? And was there ever any real resistance or anger in the process?
I
guess partly I want to know, too, what their reaction to you writing the book has been.
Yeah. I mean, I don't think there was resistance or anger. I'm now a father myself. I'm old enough to have a pretty, a forgiving attitude or just an understanding attitude about the complexity of human beings and how my childhood was difficult in some ways. My mom went to prison when I was a kid. I remember feeling afraid of, the FBI chasing us when I was little and those kinds of things. But the truth is my parents were very good parents. They were very loving to me. And I feel mostly just gratitude that despite our incredibly strange circumstances, that they were able to protect me as much as they did. There were emotional moments, my mom getting older and losing her memory at this point. So those kinds of conversations, as anybody who has an elderly relative knows, there's a kind of nostalgia and a sadness that comes with trying to kind of unpack memories and questions you've had for a long time with somebody who's, trying to be in that conversation with you, but is slowly losing some of those stories. So those were emotional times. I don't think there was anger. And to answer your question, Mike, I think in terms of what they think about the book, my dad's always been a very open, transparent person. He loves having the story out there. I don't think he thinks that I got everything right. He wrote his own memoir. He has his own ideas, but I think he thinks that mine is authentic to what I was trying to explore, and he's happy about it. My mom is a much more private person, but I think ultimately she came around and feels, glad that I was able to tell my version of the story.
Did you ever have any experiences with the FBI around your parents' involvement? I had a roommate named Davey Wellman at Berkeley, and his dad had been head of the CP in Michigan. And he told me stories as a kid how about the FBI would intercept them coming home from school and challenge them, ask them questions. Anything like that happened for you?
Well, when we were really, when I was really little, we were underground. So the FBI was just this abstract presence for me. I mean, of course, we never encountered them because the whole point was to stay away from them. I mean, when I was 3 years old, my parents were teaching me how to spot an undercover cop or an undercover FBI agent and what that might look like and what that might mean for us. So I knew about it as an abstract idea, but I never had encounters with the FBI, of course, while we were underground. Once we turned ourselves in when I was 4 or 5 years old, there were some things, certainly our phones were tapped. Certainly we had agents surveilling us when we were living in Harlem. And eventually when my mom was arrested for, refusing to testify against some of her former friends in the Black Liberation Army, I remember that day. I remember when the undercover agents showed up at our house and took her away. But yeah, it's funny because as big a presence as the FBI was in our family life, it was very abstract because, of course, they had no idea where we were.
I remember I was going to court at 26 in California here in Chicago from a bust I had. And I remember the FBI approached me asking me if I knew where your mom was. Mm-hmm. And I remember telling them, I said, I don't know where she is, but if I did, I wouldn't tell you. And they said, thank you, Mr. James. Yeah,
that's a good response. I'll tell you one amazing thing I found in those declassified FBI files that I finally got hold of. The FBI went down to interview my grandparents, Barney and Dorothy Dohrn, in Sun City, Florida, where they had retired when we were underground. And the FBI files on my mom have transcripts of the interviews between the agents and my grandparents. They're trying to get them to tell where my mom might be. And two things happened that were kind of crazy. One is my grandma, being a kind of an all-American housewife, invited the agents in and baked them chocolate chip cookies. And she was trying to be a good hostess, The other thing is, for a while they chatted, catching up on what it's like to have kids these days and that kind of thing. And then when the FBI agents realized that my grandparents weren't going to cooperate, they sort of stopped playing Mr. Nice Guy, and they would show up at my grandparents' home in the middle of the night, pound on the door, wake my grandpa up, and they would say, we have your daughter, she's dead, you have to come and identify her. And my grandfather would, put on his bathrobe and slippers and follow them in a car to the local morgue. They would open up the refrigerator and show him a young woman's dead body. Of course, it wasn't my mom, but this was a way that they were trying to sort of break my grandfather and kind of convince him to help cooperate in catching her just to avoid having her hurt. So anyway, these details in the FBI files about the lengths to which the FBI went to try to catch my family and the kind of intimate nature of those conversations and relationships.
Let me follow up on reaction again. I'd be curious to know what your brother's reaction has been to your book, both Malik and Cheza. And then maybe a little bit, you've had a lot of book readings around the country, and my reading of some of the reports on some of those are there people, old people, young people, supporters, people who think your parents ruined the movement, et cetera, et cetera. So what's your brother's reaction, and what have been some of your experiences out on the highway, so to speak, telling the story?
Yeah. I mean, my brothers, our family is pretty open about these things, and my brothers have been very supportive. They both gave interviews to me for the writing of the book. We talked extensively about our own memories of our childhoods. what that was like. Of course, Chesa, my adopted brother, Chesa Boudin, is now a public figure. He was the district attorney of San Francisco and now runs a legal clinic in Berkeley. So, it was brave of him, I would say, to kind of open up to me about these intimate details of our lives and his childhood and what it was like for him to be abandoned by his parents and to be taken in by my family. But he's read the book. He was one of my first readers, and he's been very supportive. My brother Malik is a much more private person. I don't know if he's read the book, but he was very, very nice to, give me a long interview about our shared memories of growing up. And we're still quite close. So he's not involved in the book in that way. I don't know if he's read it, but I feel very supported by the whole family. And to answer your second question, it's been wild to be touring around with the book, because I do think it's kind of coming out at a moment when people are very interested in these questions of like, what happened to the movement then and what does it mean for the movement now? So we are having old folks, boomers and movement folks show up at the readings, and kind of some people, of course, want to litigate the questions of like, did splitting SDS hurt the movement? Was the Weather Underground a positive force or a negative force? Those kinds of questions. I think the young people are much less interested in the factional disputes of that time and much more interested in the broader question of what should we be doing now? What can that history teach us about what makes an effective movement and what makes an ineffective movement? What I try to do in the book through telling these stories is give us some kind of signposts, both for how that revolutionary moment can inspire people who want to resist right now, and also some of the kind of Achilles heels of the movement around things like ideological purity tests and factionalism that you can see happening in the left again today, and I think are really dangerous to any movement that wants to build a broad coalition.
And probably violence, too, plays a role in there.
Absolutely, violence. There's big debates about, how far is too far and all that kind of stuff.
I was going to, I know Euan has a few questions, but I was going to ask what your advice is to younger organizers, younger radicals, progressives in these times. I have a granddaughter who was doing a paper on the Rainbow Coalition recently, and she was asking me a lot of questions. And I basically talked about how social change is a long, slow process, 2 steps forward, 1 step back, a few back, more forward. And a lot of people get disillusioned by how slow it is and how long it takes, and sometimes want to move to a more militant stance. And I'm just wondering what you would share with people who ask those kind of questions.
Yeah. I mean, my first instinct is to say, I don't want to give young people too much advice. I feel like even at my age, in my 40s, I'm too old to be telling the movement what to do next. I mean, I do have a lot of faith. I have 2 kids of my own. One is 18, one is 21. And I have a lot of faith in this generation who has come of age in this very dangerous, disturbing moment in American history to kind of help us, fight through it and find a better way forward. Of course, if I thought I had nothing to offer, or that the movement of the 60s and 70s had nothing to offer, I wouldn't have written the book. I hope that young folks can read this history and glean from it, the way we always can with history, the sacrifices that have come before, the courage that their ancestors showed, the imagination that, people like Dr. King and Fred Hampton and the Panthers and even members of the Weather Underground were able to show about what it looks like when we militantly resist oppression. I think those are all good lessons. But I also just want them to tell us how to do better next time.
Euan.
Well, I was wondering, I don't think it's a coincidence that Chicago is central to a lot of this. Obviously, you mentioned Martin Luther King being here in the 1960s, and obviously one of the first major weather operations, the Days of Rage, was here in Chicago. The SDS split was here in Chicago. And so I'm just sort of wondering, what's your sense of the Chicago in all of this? And of course, now you've made your career and life and career here in the city. I mean, I think we maybe don't recognize, we often look to New York or Los Angeles, but I think Chicago is central to all this. So I'm just wondering your take on the Chicago at all.
100%. I think it's a Chicago story, and I think it's a Chicago story because Chicago has been the heart of activist radical resistance in America going back over 100 years. 200 years. I think, going back all the way to the Haymarket Square, quote unquote riot and on, right? But you're right. In the book, I kept noticing how my mother's story and the story of SDS and the story of the Weather Underground always comes back to Chicago. It's, it starts with my mom's work with Dr. King and the rent strike. It goes through SDS, through the partnership with Fred Hampton and the Black Panthers, through Fred's murder in Chicago, through the split of SDS, the founding of Weathermen, the Days of Rage, all those things. It is a Chicago story. And I think you're right that, of course, New York and Los Angeles play a role both in this story and in the wider movement. But so much of the kind of radical activism in this country has been birthed in the Midwest and specifically here in this city. And I think folks in Chicago will see a lot of landmarks in this book about how important the city has been to that struggle.
How about talking a little bit about your deepest criticism of your parents and your fondest memory?
Yeah. Yeah, I guess my deepest criticism has to do, and I think they would cop to some of this, so I don't think it'll come as a surprise to them. But I think that, like a lot of people who are convinced that what they're doing is right, they could fall into a sort of a self-righteousness and a kind of insistence on everybody following their radical line or leaving the movement. And what that led to in the case of the Weathermen and then the Weather Underground is a sort of a narrowing of their part of the movement to the point where, they were able to be split. Of course, the FBI was very happy to help along any factional splits that were happening at the time in SDS and in the Black Panthers. And I think at my parents' worst moments, they helped those factional splits along by kind of insisting that only they had the right answers. And so I think that's a lesson to the left. My fondest memories, I writing this book, you just can't help but see both how extraordinary their courage was and their revolutionary imaginations, and also how we were, it was a loving family for all the craziness of my upbringing. I have great memories of being on the road with them, even though we were running from the FBI. We had family road trips, we had picnics, we camped out for a while at a California commune where they had some friends. And that was all just, a really nostalgic and important part of my childhood.
We have a couple minutes left. What's next on the horizon after this book? Obviously, it's been it's getting a lot of coverage. You're writing plays and teaching, I guess. What's next on the horizon for you?
Yeah, so I had a musical I wrote with the Rage Against the Machine guitarist Tom Morello that opened at the Goodman in Chicago in October. We're planning to take that to New York next year. So I'm working on kind of revisions to that and casting and all the rest that kind of builds that into that New York production. I'm working on a couple TV projects that are one based on the podcast and the book, one separate from that. And of course, yes, I'm teaching. I have some great writing students at Northwestern, trying to help them build their voices and their careers. And sending my daughter off to college. Those are my big plans.
And since you're at Northwestern, I'm going to ask you a couple questions. What's been the response of faculty members and students to Northwestern kind of caving on DEI and Palestine demonstrations and the president leaving?
Yeah. Obviously, it's been an insanely complicated and difficult time across academia at Northwestern and at every university I know of. I think there's a lot of dismay about the places where the university has caved. Certainly, the faculty has been up in arms about the deal that was made with the Trump administration. And I think most of us feel that it was a unacceptable deal and that we never should have gone into those negotiations as if it was a good faith conversation. But, you have to say that it's been widespread across academia. I don't think Northwestern's worse than many other places. So, it's a difficult time. And I think we're all trying to figure out, as everybody outside of academia is trying to figure out, how do we resist? What are the best places to have our voices heard and so on?
Zayn Ayers Dohrn, I want to thank you for joining us. It's good to see you. I saw you the other day, and you've done great work, and keep it up, brother.
Thank you, man.
There's a lot you got. You're going to continue to share. We want to thank